Welcome to the next episode of the HR Mavericks podcast. I'm Garrett Justice, and today I'm joined by Philip Romm, who's the founder at EliteHR, also the chief human capital strategist there. So Philip, how are you doing today?
I'm wonderful, Garrett. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. Before we jump in, tell our guests just a little bit more about you and your background. I know you have this wealth of experience when it comes to HR. So tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, so I have over 20 years of HR experience in multiple industries, many different positions, most recently being my own boss at EliteHR and founding a company. So trying to spark that entrepreneurial spirit and leverage my HR experience to help businesses do some of the hard work and be strategic in the HR space.
Awesome. Tell us a little more about EliteHR and the types of businesses that you work with specifically.
We work with businesses that are looking to, we really don't have any particular vertical or industry or size or anything along those lines. We look for businesses that are looking to grow, adapt, and change to the current working environment. And that means in some cases, as we'll talk more today, updating their employee-employer unwritten contract. And some of them it's cultural studies, some of them it's HR tech stacks, some of them it's globalizing. So it's really companies that are looking to say, we've got a problem, we need a strategic solution, and we're going to bring in that expertise.
I love it. That's so great. And I can definitely see how that can be needed in many businesses, large and small. So, before we jump into our topic that you kind of seeded, one question I like to ask a lot of our guests is, what really drew you to the field of HR, and kind of part two of that, what's kept you there?
So it's a great question. I wasn't drawn to it. I landed in it 20 some odd years ago. I answered an ad in the New York Times to be a part-time recruiter at a very large bank in New York City where I was living. And I landed the job kind of out of nowhere. I had zero experience. I had no background in HR. I just graduated from undergraduate school at the University of Rochester. And I loved it. I loved the fact that it's never 2 days are never the same. And so, you walk in some days, you think you have a plan, and then a sexual harassment investigation pops up and now you're off to a different mode. I like, as a generalist, that you get to have your fingers in a lot of different pots. And so you have to know a lot about a lot of things. So there's a lot of opportunity. And I would say what's kept me in it the most is that HR has evolved from what it was 20 years ago. I mean, my first title 20 years ago, was personnel manager. And so that is a very transactional, operational kind of feel, to now much more strategic, helping businesses grow, working them do adaptive change to drive an ROI. So that's what sort of, keeps me going and helps me stay in the field.
I love it. That's great. I'm not hearing the New York accent. It must have just faded over the last 20 years. Is that it?
I don't really have one. I've worked really hard to not have one, but I now have lived just about as much out of New York as I've lived in it. So maybe we'll see what happens.
Maybe it'll slip in a little bit here and there. So we would love that. So, well, Philip, you kind of seeded this idea for what we're going to talk about today. And specifically, you kind of proposed this idea of, businesses, employees, employers have typically this unwritten contract. And in most companies, that's changed or is in the process of changing. So we want to talk a little bit about that today. So I guess to start us off, tell us a little bit more from your perspective, or what was in the past, the older unwritten employee-employer contract? What did that typically look like at businesses?
Yeah, I would say in my career, I've gone through sort of 3 different changes and shifts in that unwritten employer-employee contract. When I first started my career, the unwritten employee-employer contract was almost a cradle to grave kind of philosophy. When you walked out of college, you walked into your company, you stayed there for 50 years, you got your gold watch at retirement, and you put your kids through college, you bought your house, your cars, you went on your 2 to 3 weeks of vacation, and that's where you stayed, and you didn't look to leave, and you got a moderate potential increase every year. And that was sort of that. The company took care of you, the old company man or company woman kind of idea. And then, right around the start of the early 2000s, right after 9/11, that started to break down a little bit when companies started to say, okay, well, it's no longer really a feasible relationship for us to have this sort of 50-year employee anymore. We're going to do much more flexible models, and they got rid of their defined benefit pension plans and they went to defined contribution 401ks. Layoffs started to become a bit more of the norm in terms of when they needed to right size or downsize or upsize their staffing models, and that sort of kind of became much more of that ruling. And then from the employee side, once that loyalty from the employer was broken, it became much more of a job hopping. I'm going to leave now for different opportunities to either grow salary. I know I did that earlier on in my career, opportunity, title, relocation, whatever it was. There wasn't that sense of loyalty back to the employer because they weren't no longer taking care of all of my needs. And as kids who watch their parents do that, now they're in their own employer kind of agreement where they no longer want work to be the central part of their lives. Work is a part of their lives. It's no longer the defining aspect of their lives. So, people now, it's much more of a humanistic model. I think it was breaking pre-COVID. I think COVID sped up the break, and to where now work is a function of who you are, not the only function. And employers now are in this great mist of, do we get everybody back to an office? Do we stay remote? Employees want flexibility. We think we've invested all this money in office space, so that great conversation is still happening. But now we're looking at people as humans and saying that the balance and the distinction between home life and work life is no longer a distinction. This is who the person is. This is who Garrett is. This is who Phil Romm is. And this is what Phil Romm needs. This is what Garrett needs. And how do we bring that about to get the best out of both people to allow them to have full lives that include a working relationship?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think most would, exactly what you said would resonate with most people. I think we've all seen that evolution from parents, grandparents, being the company man or company woman to, early 2000s, like you said, that's starting to break down to COVID really changing and speeding a lot of this up. So, right or wrong, it is what it is. And it's the state of what most companies are facing right now. So you kind of described a little bit of like what that new employee-employer contract is, in that it's the person and it's more holistic, right? And what does that actually mean though for employers? Like what are the impacts or the changes that employers have to be thinking about with this kind of new unwritten contract that has emerged?
Yeah, it's a couple of really, really key things, and it's a very different kind of conversation. It's a conversation around, I'm not going to stay at this job if it no longer fits my values, which is a very different conversation than I've ever heard in the workplace before. And people are taking and choosing jobs that fit along their values. So employers now have to not only offer great pay, great benefits, all of those things that still drive the market, they have to make sure that their values are aligned to where their employees want to be and are. And by that, I mean things like, if you say you are an eco-conscious culture, then you have to live being an eco-conscious culture and do things like recycle coffee grinds if you have a in-house office. If you have an in-house office, do you have green space in your office? Or do you use green energy? Do you yourself as the CEO drive a hybrid car, or are you showing up in your 10 mile to the gallon Hummer? And those types of things, because that's what's going to resonate with the current employees when they look at what the values are to match their values. As an example, you say you are a remote-based company, but if you have policies that say everybody must live within 1 or 2 states in the United States, well, then are you really a remote-based company, or are you just a company that lets people work from home? And so there are conversations around that is happening all the time. If you say, and I'd like to put it in this type of language, people now are evaluating performance-driven opportunities. So being measured based on output versus time and space. And by time and space, I mean things like showing up in an office and working 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. That old sort of model where they got a performance review once a year and they either, were satisfactory or unsatisfactory. That's no longer the case. They want outcome-driven sort of metrics and outcome-driven feedback, and they want to not be able to say no to the 6 p.m. meeting that interferes with some sort of life activity, whether it's parents, it's sports, whether it's single individuals, whatever, game time or other types of things. Ironically, I was reading an article this morning where the company drinks after work is now becoming an issue because individuals no longer want to socialize in that manner. So companies that are looking to get workers back to work are struggling because individuals no longer value that as an activity.
Yeah.
So it's a very values driven kind of thing. And it's, if you don't meet my values, I'm not going to work for you. So you have to find the values that attract to me.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think that totally resonates. The thought process that where my mind's going, on this topic is how is this different for different sizes of companies or in different industries, right? So like you mentioned some things, especially related to like the in-office remote work. There are certain industries you think of, a small plumbing business or HVAC or construction or restaurants or retail where, they have to be on site. You can't necessarily do a lot of that work remote. So what's the change that's happening, if at all, in these types of businesses, right? Or is this something that's just happening in certain industries or segments of companies?
I think it's certainly, there's a greater freedom in, say, professional services, where some of this can be much more easily documented and seen. In retail, manufacturing, warehousing, and physical space where you need to have people on site, it's significantly harder, but not impossible to do. And where that sort of becomes seen in like an HVAC company or a doctor's office or a warehouse is you have systems set up for flexible scheduling, shift sharing, shift swapping, right? Where that you have a technology process where instead of calling out for the day, I maybe swap my shift with a peer who does a similar job that needs to now take off because of a sick child. And so you could not go into overtime because you're shift sharing or shift swapping or job sharing. I mean, we've all talked about these sorts of things for years, but now there are real opportunities to sort of bring them about, and the technology is readily available. And that was one of the limiting factors years ago, was that there wasn't a really effective way to send a text message out saying this shift is available, anybody want to take it? Or
Sure.
I need to take this day off, can we swap a shift? And I noticed you're working this day, can we swap that shift? And not have to have supervisory management sort of intervention on all of these very sort of day-to-day interactions that management probably doesn't need to be involved in on a real basis, that the employees can handle if you give them the autonomy, responsibility, training, and tools. So whereas, it's become something along those lines. In an HVAC or kind of retail situation, it's about also having really great incentives and understanding that employees are going to also need to call out and be out, and things are going to happen. And then not using that as a situation to text somebody on a Saturday night saying, you must get your body into work or you're going to be fired, right? Like those types of messages just, aren't resonating anymore. And people are more and more saying, okay, thanks very much, goodbye. That message no longer scares the employee to come in. And so it's about having opportunity, autonomy, ability to make decisions, even in a retail and more manufacturing type environment that gives the employee the opportunity to sort of own their time and participate in this new unwritten contract.
That totally resonates. I can definitely see how that's the case. So, I mean, the next question that naturally comes to mind for me is, how do these businesses, the employers, figure out what their employees most value? I mean, you could simply go ask them, right? And that's probably where to start. But what other tips do you have in helping employers figure out what are those values? Is it flexibility? Is it this? Is it that? Does it vary very much? Or are there a core set of values that most employees care about today, regardless of the company, right? How do employers figure that out so that they can then start to tailor, their internal processes to those values?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think that for one, surveys certainly is a way. Go ahead and ask a survey. I'm not always the biggest fan of surveys. You get typically low response rates. You end up having to chase people. They tell you what you think you want to hear. So I'm not usually a big fan of surveys. But what you could do is you can create a bottom-up movement. You can simply have sort of town hall sessions, and it's got to be more than one, and it's got to be transparent, and it's got to be something where if somebody makes a bold suggestion, they don't get their head chopped off the next day. They can't, so that you have to encourage that kind of talk, where you simply just have forums where you're asking the employees, we're thinking about doing X, what do you think? Would you find this to sort of be valuable? Or let's generate some ideas, and no ideas is too dumb. Let's moonshoot this, give us sort of the, what you're going to find valuable, understanding we can't do them all. And have a transparent, open conversation, and then do one or two, pilot it for 6 months, see what the response is, see if it tracks and retains individuals, see if it works. And if it works, then you can expand it to make it a bigger one. If it doesn't work, then you could retrench and try something new. But I think if you start the conversation with the employees that we're willing to meet your needs and develop what you think is going to be valuable within our set of values, which ebb and flow over time. They shouldn't be concrete, so concrete that they can't be changed. Then you can find that the employees would be willing to sort of talk to you about it. One of the biggest things I'd say is the hiccups is leadership can't do this without authenticity, and they can't do it without transparency. So if you're just doing this to do it, employees will find that you're fake, and then they won't participate. If you're not transparent, employees will notice that as well. And if employees themselves find that they're getting shown the door or loss of opportunity or somehow because of a suggestion that they make, then that will also drive people back to not participate further. So there are a lot of things that you can do, and there's some tips that you probably shouldn't do, and sort of to help make a successful conversation.
I love the point about authenticity there, because, the thing that I was really thinking about is I'm sure that there are, small business owners, people in leadership who have lived through these different transitions of the changes of this employee-employer contract, right? Maybe they were raised and kind of started their career in that, lifer situation before they started their own thing or something like that, right? And so I can imagine that for some of those people, it's probably difficult to understand, like, why are we doing this? And so for those people who might not initially just inherently get it, right? For those leaders, what would you say are the impacts for those businesses who don't invest time doing these things authentically and transparently to really tailor to that new employee-employer contract?
Yeah, I think over time they will begin to see that they will lose out on the top talent. They will lose out on opportunities to grow into new markets, into different markets, into new things. And time has a way of passing these companies by. It's an adapt or die mentality. And if you don't start doing the hard adaptation work now, it's going to become harder as the company moves along and gets into a potential, dire straits issue. Everybody wants A players in their company, but A players want to go work in A cultures, A-rated cultures, and that fit and meet their values and needs. They don't want to go work for B's and C's cultures, right? So if you don't want to have the B's and C players, you've got to start having that A mentality, and you have to do the adaptive change, and that all starts with some very hard conversations, and it starts, slowly. This has to be a radical, one day your culture is this, and the next day your culture is that, but you have to start that process. Otherwise, it's going to adapt or die.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So what other advice would you give to, especially a small business owner or the solo HR person who hears this message, sees the change and wants to start that progress, making that progress of changes at their company? What other advice would you give to them of like where to
Yeah,
start?
yeah, I would say that the thing I would say is, kudos to you if you're recognizing that you need to have this conversation. And I would say is if you're not ready to hold it yourself or you don't know where to begin, talk to someone like me, talk to other people that in the space that can give you sort of that jump start, that starting point, that little bit of advice, that sounding board. You don't have to go it alone. And there are great books on this sort of topic that give you some freedom to experiment. And that's an opportunity for you to sort of say, how do I go about this? Where do I start? I don't know what I don't know, and I'm going to bring in and talk to an expert.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a way to do that. And I hate the term expert. I much prefer a term like, advisor or, a
Yeah.
consultant type relationship, because it isn't about me giving you expertise. It's about me being a sounding board for your ideas.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. So, wow, Philip, this has been an awesome conversation. I can definitely see how this is applicable for really any business out there. I mean, this is something that everyone's facing right now with these changes that we've seen in the world. So, thank you for joining and sharing some of that knowledge or expertise, if you will, right, with us today. As we kind of wrap up here, one of the last questions I really like to ask a lot of our guests is what's a commonly held belief, regarding HR among small businesses that you passionately disagree with? It may or may not be related to our topic today, but I'm curious, like what your point of view is on something that really stands out as you've worked with all of these different businesses. What's that commonly held belief that you disagree with?
That we don't need this. That we don't need this level of sophistication, that we're good, that this doesn't apply to us, or any sort of deviation of that sort of theme. Because my answer is you will, and it will affect you. And if you want to grow, these are types of things that you need to start to think about. And whether you're the 5-person mom and pop Main Street firm struggling to make your hires, or whether you're the 50-person manufacturing firm in a regional sort of location, these all, the sophistication matters, and people do notice when some of this, when you start to listen to them. And so I would say that the thing that bothers me the most is when companies don't believe that they need to or can be sophisticated.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you kind of hit on that earlier on that, previously maybe there weren't the right tools or resources out there to support, especially these small businesses, but that's no longer the case today,
Right.
right? Like
No,
you can be sophisticated as a very small business with the right tools and resources.
yeah.
And you have you can be nimble enough to make those pivots and changes, right?
Not only that, and the price points now are so relatively low per employee, per employee per month, that it makes almost not investing, a long-term issue. I keep using this type of example where if your employees are hired, you're going out, you're hiring rock stars, and you sit them down in an office on day one with a stack of 30 pages of forms and a pen, you've got a problem. That's something
Yeah.
that if you're still doing that, that is a tremendous onboarding issue, and that is the first cultural step that this person is experiencing in your company. And you've basically just told them that you are antiquated,
Yeah.
and lack the resources or lack the investment, and don't really care what they think or what their experiences have been. And the funny thing is, a lot of kids in school today aren't even taught cursive or penmanship in any great strength. So there's going to come a point in the next sort of generation or so where they're not going to be able to fill out these forms. So
Yeah.
at some point, you're going to have to, again, adapt or die. So the sophistication doesn't have to be overly complex or overly expensive, but it does have to start.
Yeah, great point. Love it. Well, Philip, this has been an awesome conversation. If there are listeners who want to get contact with you, either to learn more about the topic or learn more about working with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
The best way is to contact me by email. It's Phil, PHIL, at HR-elite.com.
Awesome. We will drop that in the show notes if you're listening. And so you can find that email address there. Don't have to worry about writing it down. Phil, thank you so much again for joining us today. And we hope you have a great rest of the day.
You too. Thank you, Garrett. Thank you, everybody, for listening.